You so much, Jeannie. And thank you, everyone. I've heard so much about the Grace Group, so it's really great to be here. And it is honestly, coming from where I come from, an honor to be asked to do anything for Alcoholics Anonymous at all. If you hear sounds in the background, that's just my cat. He's having fun, and hopefully we'll have some fun too. So I usually like to start with I flip to a page in the book and I see what comes up and I see what God's got for me. And tonight I flipped open to chapter 4, We Agnostics, and it feels right because it says, if when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or, and that's a big or, it doesn't say and. It says, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably an alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience can conquer. And that part is important to me because I don't really get into my story that much. But what I do get into is the fact that I was a 10-year-old who needed a drink, man. And I was an 11-year-old and a 12-year-old and a 14-year-old who needed a drink. I was terrified of everything. I was terrified of going to the swim meets. I was terrified of doing well in school. I was terrified of doing bad in school. That didn't make me an alcoholic. I was terrified of my family. That didn't make me an alcoholic. I moved when I was 12. That didn't make me an alcoholic. But I was a kid in need of a drink. I was a kid in need of a spiritual solution. And when I finally found that spiritual solution in alcohol, it was like my driver's license says I'm 6 feet tall. You can't see me, but I'm barely 5'10". I felt like I was 6 feet tall. I felt like I was the muscliest guy in the room. I felt like I could talk to women, I could talk to men, I could make friends. And the next day, my girlfriend at the time drove me. I was so hungover, I wanted to puke out the side of the car. She drove me to Dunkin' Donuts at 6:30 in the morning, and I was 18 years old, and I could not wait to do that again. And basically, my story is just like a lot of other drunks and addicts' story. I didn't want to feel like myself. I thought that who I was and who I wanted to be was not good enough for my parents or my girlfriend or my friends or my college or the professor or whoever. It was never going to be good enough, and I could escape that by drinking. And it worked for a while. I'm not going to lie to you. I had some fun. I felt 6 feet tall all the time. I felt like I could talk to people when I was drinking. But then the next day, I always felt this sense of loneliness that kind of only alcoholics can really experience. And I went to my first AA meeting when I was 26, and I kind of breezed past my story because, like, we all know how to drink, guys. That's why we're here. Everybody got a different number of DUIs. Everybody got a different number of broken relationships. Everybody's got a different number of money that they lost in their pursuit of alcohol ultimately. But we're here because we have two things in common. One of them is the allergy to alcohol, which I break out in a more active addiction when I drink alcohol. And the second one is I can't stop thinking about alcohol when I start. So I didn't know those things at the time, but I knew that something was going wrong in my mind and in my life, and my friends started moving up in the world, and I just wasn't moving up in the world, and I couldn't figure out why. So I lived in this seaside town. It's very cute. It's got bricks, and it all the shops have like SHOPPE in the name, like that kind of thing. It was very cute. And I went to a meeting in that town, Newburyport, Massachusetts, and the guy was up there telling a war story. And I walked into that meeting probably with my arms crossed, probably not ready to hear anything, but nobody pulled me aside and explained alcoholism to me. Nobody saw that I was a newcomer. I just listened to some old guy's story, and he told me how bad his life had been and how he had done some things that I thought were things that I would never do. And so I went home to my mom and I said, I tried AA and it doesn't work. And she said, I'm so proud of you, honey. Thank you for giving it a shot. And I went to one other meeting, decided it wasn't for me because everybody else there had done worse things than I felt I had done. And so I felt like, well, I probably don't have a drinking problem. I can manage this on my own. And one of my other favorite parts in the big book, I hope it just opens up to this. Yeah. It says the fact is, for most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. And I didn't know what that meant for a long time. I didn't know that I had already at this time, when I was 26, going to AA meetings, at some point between when I was 18 and alcohol was a spiritual solution for me, and now I had lost the power of choice. And I don't know when that happened, but between the ages of about 26 to 34, I was just the type of drinker that is annoying. I wasn't doing anything particularly bad, but I was annoying all the time. I was riding my bike home in New York City, drunk as a skunk, blacked out. I was convinced I was going to get run over by a garbage truck and my mom would have to come identify my body. But that didn't stop me from drinking. I had relationships that ended, and that didn't stop me from drinking. I didn't know that I had lost the power of choice. So I get to be 34 and I'm on this date, and she has precisely 2 glasses of wine, I remember, and she had to work the next day. So she says, no, I'm good. And I'm doing the alcoholic math while I'm looking at the board behind the bar, and I'm thinking, how many ounces times the ABV times the money I'll have to pay will get me the most drunk while also looking normal. So I end up only having 3, but getting pretty drunk because I found the 16-ounce high ABV IPA or whatever they were selling. And she gives me a hug and she's nice about it, but it's clear there's not going to be a second date. So I get an Uber home to go home. And on the way home, I change it to the bar. And I got really drunk alone. And I remember thinking, something is wrong here. I really can't pick my spots anymore. I didn't know about the allergy to alcoholism. I didn't know about the mental obsession. But I go the next day to a meeting of not Alcoholics Anonymous because all I wanted to be was not an alcoholic. The last thing I wanted to be was an alcoholic because in my mind, alcoholics were from The Simpsons and they sit around in the circle and talk about all their problems and everybody's life is really miserable. And I didn't want to be like that. So I went to a meeting of journalists that talked about drinking because I really wanted to be a journalist and I lived in New York City and my ego was about 3 times the size of every room I went into. And I really looked up to journalists. So I was like, yeah, I'll just lie and say I'm a journalist and get into this meeting. So we're already starting with dishonesty. And I go to this meeting and somebody else comes in and they say, well, you should probably go to AA, find a sponsor who wants what you have, who has what you want. And I say, great, there's this guy in the meeting and he's got a cool car, he's got a cool job, and he's got a cool girlfriend. And I'm like, that's my guy. I have no idea what the spiritual solution is. All I know is that I can probably make some friends in Alcoholics Anonymous and not drink. And I can dump my old friends that drank and I can make new friends that don't drink and we'll all be happily ever after. So I'm in New York City and I start going to these discussion meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. And these are real AA meetings, but they sit around in a circle and they talk about what's going on in their life. Or even better, they sit around the circle and there's a mini lead where I get to speak for 20 minutes and then everybody goes around and tells me how good my share was. That was my favorite type of meeting. And we would go around and just talk about how bad our lives were or were before we stopped drinking. And there was no real solution. And I'm drinking 2 Bang energy drinks before the meeting and 1 after the meeting and going to work. And I'm still getting sick and I'm still getting more and more dishonest, more insecure, more jealous. All of my character defects are actually getting bigger now that I haven't taken a drink. Because what used to happen is my character defects would go off for like 18 hours a day, from the time I woke up until the time I could go to the bar. And then my character defects went away because I had a drink in me. I was finally able to listen to you. I was finally able to ask questions. I wanted something from you, but I was able to ask questions. I was finally able to tone down that little insecure boy that had needed a drink when he was 10 and 11 and 12 and 13. I was finally able to turn down that person when I had a couple of drinks in me. And so now you took the drink away, and I go to a 7:15 a.m. meeting every morning, and everybody's still kind of miserable, and I'm getting more and more miserable. So I did the thing that any alcoholic would do. I met a girl from Rochester, New York, about 6.5 hours away, and I moved there immediately. And I went there 9 months sober. My sponsor at the time was working on his 6th step. I didn't know that was a problem. I didn't know that I had to do step work to stay sober. I just knew I was 9 months sober and this was as good as it was going to get. I was sick as a dog and I was getting into a relationship that was about to make me sicker and I had no idea. So I go to Rochester, New York. I start living in a small town. My ego takes a big hit because I'm Mr. New York City, remember? And I go to Rochester, New York, and I get a new sponsor, and I start working what I like to call John's program. Because when people say there's my program and your program, I say, not really, there's the program, because I worked my program, and my program got me sick. I started working John's program, which is making some of the 4-step lists in the way that I wanted to, telling my sponsors some of the things that I thought would make me look kind of cool, but not some of the things that I thought would make me look like the jealous, insecure, kind of small guy that I really was, that I felt on the inside. I started having some friends, but I would never really let anybody in an AA meeting get super close to me because the last thing I wanted to do was be associated with alcoholics. I wanted to go to enough meetings that my girlfriend thought I was sober, and I wanted to make enough amends that I could technically tell my sponsor I was making amends, but I didn't actually want to clean up my side of the street. I didn't actually want to get well this entire time. So fast forward a little bit, I get a commitment. I'm going into the maximum security prison in Rochester, and man, that helped my ego quite a bit. I was like, man, I'm in there with the hard guys. Like these guys are really serious. I'm taking this commitment into the maximum security prison. Like I'm not just sober, I'm the best sober guy there's ever been. Like, and my ego is through the roof, and I'm getting sick in a way where I don't realize that I'm getting sick. And I go back to that part where it says we've lost the power of choice. At this point, I'm about a year sober. I live in Rochester, New York. My relationship is already rocky. And I don't realize that I've already lost the power of choice. I'm a ticking time bomb and I'm gonna drink again. But I don't realize that. When it finally happened, it felt like I had changed my mind. And that was the scariest part. So I'm at a convention, and I had been to a couple conventions. If you're ever in Rochester, the Flower City Fellowship Convention is a really great one. And I also realized I forgot to say I have a home group. It's Parkway West in Pittsburgh. Meets at 7:30. There's a big book meeting. It's awesome. Text me if you want the info for that. I also sponsor Men in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm sponsored by Men in Alcoholics Anonymous. You're usually supposed to say that at the top, but we didn't, and we're rolling. So I go to the Flower City Fellowship Convention, and I'm sitting at the table. I don't have a ticket to the convention because I didn't really want to hear the speakers. I wanted to be there to be seen. I wanted to make my service commitment into a kind of fill up of my ego, a spiritual fill up of my ego. And so I go to this fellowship convention, and I'm sitting outside the speakers at the table at the corrections committee table. And I think that I am Mr. Big Shot. I'm Mr. AA. Like I am going into the maximum security prison. People are walking by and telling me how great it is that I go into the maximum security prison. And I'm saying like, why aren't more women asking me about the maximum security prison? I'm sure I could tell them really interesting things about the maximum security prison and how cool I am for going in there. And finally, this guy walks over, and he's different than me. And I don't know if I can totally describe why he was different than me, but when you live in New York City and you have an ego and you're an alcoholic, you get this feeling that is like, I am at the center of the universe and everybody else revolves around me. I take the Q train and I look at the Brooklyn Bridge over the train going to my dinky little job, and I see the Statue of Liberty behind the train, and I think I'm the biggest, baddest person that's ever lived, drunk or sober. And I brought that feeling with me to Rochester, New York. And this guy starts approaching me, and he looks a lot different than me. I desperately want to vape during this meeting. I won't. So I have no business judging anybody for their nicotine habits, but he had a big wad of chew and he's spitting it into a bottle. And I thought he's different than me because he does that. I vape. He does that. He's different than me. He was wearing different clothes. I thought he's different than me. This guy, he's just like a yokel, local yokel. He can't teach me anything. And he sits down at the table, and I'm like, oh my God, why is this guy sitting down? Like, I came to this meeting to be seen and to have my ego stroked for being Mr. AA. And now this guy is sitting down at the table and he's so different than me. And his wife is telling him to like, let's go. And he's like, no, 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 this guy's sick. Let me sit down real quick. And I'm like, I'm not sick, so I'm ready to fight. He sits down and he says, how's your steps going? And that is one of the most profound questions I've ever been asked. Because at the time, my steps were looking a lot like this. My steps were looking like I had lied to my sponsor about 4 and 5 because I wanted to make amends to my ex-girlfriends. I had flown my current girlfriend out to Los Angeles to make amends to one of my ex-girlfriends. That's how my amends looked. She would wait in the car while I made amends to my exes. Like I was making amends in order to show other people how good I was at Alcoholics Anonymous. That was what my amends looked like. That's what my step 9 looked like. But he asked me how step 12's going. And I couldn't even remember what step 12 was. And I'm definitely not sponsoring anybody because nobody's coming up to me, because I think when you're sick in Alcoholics Anonymous, luckily you sort of radiate the sickness and people stay away from you. Or at least that's how it was for me. And I had no sponsees. I was not doing 10 and 11. You couldn't catch me with a nightly inventory or a morning meditation. But I was gossiping with my friends about Alcoholics Anonymous and people in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was telling my parents how great it was being sober and how important I was in Alcoholics Anonymous. I was dragging my girlfriend to amends she shouldn't have been a part of, and amends that I probably shouldn't have been making anyway. And so I look at him and I say, "How are my steps going? I have 2.5 years, man." And he's like, "Yeah, but like, why aren't you sponsoring anybody?" And I'm like, "What?" Like, I don't know. I have 2.5 years. I'm sober. And little did I know in that moment, God was doing for me what I couldn't do for myself. That night I come home and I sobbed to my girlfriend in this, like, I don't know if anybody here has performatively cried to get somebody on their side, but I sobbed to her and I said, I'm just so glad we're together and so glad that I'm sober. And I'm fully crazy. I'm the craziest I've ever been in this moment, telling this woman that I love, who I'm getting an engagement ring made for, that I'm glad I'm sober. And inside, what I'm actually thinking is, I finally have an excuse to quit AA because this guy who is so different than me came up and he challenged me. And I finally have an excuse to quit AA. I've been waiting for this. I've been wanting to take a drink for 2.5 years. The power of choice had been long gone. And I didn't know about the allergy and the mental obsession. So I thought, I've been sober 2.5 years. And like the next day, I told her this. And she's like, weren't you just crying yesterday about how glad you were to be sober? And I was like, yeah, but now I'm happy to that I'm sober and I can drink again. And she's sort of backing away and she's sort of confused and she's like, okay, I don't want to be there when you drink again. But I call my mom and I say, Mom, I think I've been sober 2.5 years. I'm going to try just drinking. I think I'm normal. And there's another part in this book where it says the great obsession of every abnormal drinker is to drink like other people. And that's exactly what I was doing, but I was not in the book, so I had no idea. I convinced my therapist, I convinced my psychiatrist that like maybe smart recovery is better for me. I don't need AA. I need something else that's for smart people. I liked smart recovery because it has smart in the name and I felt very smart, so I wanted to do that instead of Alcoholics Anonymous, which has alcoholics in the name, and I didn't want to be an alcoholic. So I call this guy who is so different than me and I call him up and I'm like, man, I don't think I'm an alcoholic. And he's like, he laughs in that way that only sponsors can laugh at you. And he laughs in a way that made me feel like he's probably heard this 25 times before, but he says, let's just flip to page 52. And I told him I was flipping to page 52, but I was really just walking around outside. I had no book anywhere in sight. And he said, let me do this thing that now I do with my sponsees, where I take things that are in the book as statements and I turn them into questions. And he says, let me just ask you a couple questions. And at this part in page 52, Bill is talking about that we've conquested the air, we've done all these things, but we still have these human problems. And he's talking about things that are not drinking. He's talking about things that are not using. He's talking about things that are human problems that we have to solve as alcoholics or we're going to drink again. And he says, we had to ask ourselves why we shouldn't apply to our human problems the same readiness to change our point of view. He had just been talking about God. So he's saying, can we change our point of view about these things, about human nature? And my sponsor, my now sponsor, asked me a couple questions. He says, are you having trouble in personal relationships? And I said, well, no, not really, because I had a girlfriend. Little did he know if we saw her ex at the Home Depot, I would freak out for 4 days. I could barely be around her brother-in-law who knew more about HVAC than me because I felt like stunned and kind of unable to talk to him because he was so smart about HVAC and I didn't know any of that stuff. And I said, no, my personal relationships are pretty good. Keep in mind, I've lost the power of choice at this point and I don't know it. He says, can you control your emotional natures? And I'm like, well, yeah, unless my ex-girlfriend brings up the fact that she's had a boyfriend before me, I can certainly control my emotional nature. And he says, are you a prey to misery and depression? Again, he's just reading off page 52. This is what Bill W. wrote that we have to solve in order to stay sober. And I said, I'm not a prey to misery and depression. I'm on 6 antidepressants. I'm on a bipolar drug. I'm on this other thing. Like, I'm not a prey to misery and depression. I have a therapist and a psychiatrist. How can I be depressed? And he says, okay. And he says, you couldn't make a living. And I said, well, yeah, I haven't worked in a while, but that's because my work is in politics and it's cyclical. And like, meanwhile, I haven't worked in a year and I've burned bridges, drunk and sober. He says, do you have a feeling of uselessness? And are you full of fear? And are you unhappy? And I said, sort of, But in my mind, what I knew I wanted to say was, I'm unhappy. I'm full of fear. I have a feeling of uselessness. And I know that the thing that will fix that is the same thing that fixed those things for that little kid that was 10 years old and that little kid that was 18 years old, a drink. And I said, I just don't think I'm an alcoholic because I wanted a drink so bad. And all I wanted was for somebody in Alcoholics Anonymous to tell me to take it. And he said, the other thing they say in the book is try it. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Finally, somebody is speaking my language. He says, try to have 2 beers and then no more, no less. And I say, okay. And I'm convinced in my mind at this moment that all I've done is change my mind. I don't know about the allergy. I don't know about the mental obsession. I don't know that I've already lost the power of choice and it is a done deal that I'm going to burn my life to the ground again. I don't know any of that. And I say, great. The first day I watch a baseball game, my girlfriend's too scared to be around me when I have one IPA. I have one and a half, like, let's not lie. It goes fine. The world doesn't fall apart. I'm like, thank God I'm not an alcoholic. Oh my God, I'm not one of you people. I don't have to go to those meetings. The next day I have two. The next day I have three. It's fine. We're still fine. 3 beers is nothing. The next day I have four, and I tell my girlfriend I have three. So we're 4 days in, and I'm lying about my drinking. That should have been a red flag, but I didn't know I have an allergy to alcohol and I have a mental obsession when it comes to this stuff. About 3 weeks later, I wake up from a brownout and I had somehow driven a stick shift for the first time in 20 years to drive a girl home from a bar who was not my girlfriend. And she's sitting on my couch and I wake up from this brownout. I realize that I'm gonna have to tell my girlfriend this, that drunk math where you're like, I can't get out of this situation. So maybe I'll just attack it straight on. I say, how did we get here? And she says, you drove us here. What are you talking about? And I'm like, I haven't driven a stick shift in 20 years. And she said, well, you have to drive us back. So I drive back to my car. It's about midnight. I've realized I have sent phone calls to my girlfriend and we have talked for a few minutes and I don't know what we talked about because I had blacked out at a bar because within 3 weeks, my drinking had already progressed to the point where I'm blacking out before 9 o'clock at night. The next day, I would love to tell you I went to a meeting and I got instantly struck sober. God came down in a white light and showed me the error of my ways. That is not what happened. The next day, I woke up in the pitiful moral despair they talk about in the book. I was an absolute wreck. And I said, I do know the one thing that will fix this. And I Googled, and the local bar was open at 11:30, and I was there at 11:27. And for those minutes while I was drinking, I was okay. The world was falling down around me. I didn't know what to do. But while I was drinking, in the act of putting the alcohol in my mouth, I was okay. But the problem is, I have an allergy to alcohol. So when I put one in my mouth, my body does something. It metabolizes it. Joe and Charlie explained this really well. I can't do it justice, but my body metabolizes that alcohol into something that wants more alcohol. And that's all that it wants. And it doesn't matter if I had kids. It doesn't matter my relationship. It doesn't matter if I want to impress my parents and make them proud to have a good son. None of that matters. I need another drink. So I somehow rip myself off the bar after 4 drinks, go to work for 4 hours, and then we have dinner with the brother-in-law who knows a lot about HVAC, and we and his nieces or his kids who are her nieces, and we have dinner, and I'm like, well, the only way I'm gonna get through this dinner is having a couple drinks. I have a couple drinks, and I'm not drunk, and I'm like, I won. I did it. I've only had 8 drinks today, and I'm thinking like that's some sort of victory. I go over and I play on the trampoline with the little kids. Spoiler alert, you're not supposed to be drunk around little kids. I found that out after the fact, but like I didn't know that at the time. I go to dinner and my girlfriend that night is like, why were you angry at me during dinner? And I was like, I'm not angry at her. I'm not angry with you at all. But what I didn't tell her was I had had 8 drinks during the day when I was supposed to be at work and right before I went and hung out with her little nieces. So the next day I wake up, I have the pitiful moral despair, like the absolute bottom. I don't realize that I'm having a rock bottom experience, but that's what's happening. And the only thing I can think to do is go to a noon meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. And oops, sorry, my cat got really excited. Um, At this noon meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, I go and I get a 24-hour coin. And this is not a knock on noon meetings. This is not a resentment. I have worked this out, but this is just my experience. What I heard was keep coming back. And what I heard was rejection is God's protection. And I'm standing there crying because I know I'm about to have to tell my girlfriend that I basically cheated on her and I've been lying about my drinking for 3 weeks. And I know she's going to break up with me. And I know that's going to happen within the hour. And what I hear is keep coming back. And I want to put a gun in my mouth before I come back to Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't want to do any of this. And I walk out of that noon meeting, I go home. She does break up with me. I don't have anywhere to go. I own a house, but I can't go back there because there's too many memories. I throw my stuff in the back of the car and I do the most selfish thing I did in this whole ordeal. I call my friend who's a single mom with a 6-month-old, and I'm like, I need to stay on your couch. And with God's grace, she says yes. And I have to go to New York City to stay on her couch. It's about a 6-hour drive. And on the drive, I call my old sponsor who had not done the steps. He basically says, yeah, I knew this would happen. I call my other friend who's in the process of dumping me as a friend because I went out. And she says, yeah, I knew this would happen, something like that. And she says, you're doing the best you can. And I say, well, my best isn't very good. And that's how I felt. I felt like the lowest of the low. My best was not only not good enough, my best has gotten me into the worst position that I've ever been in. So I finally decide in my desperation, God was there somehow. I have my little Beats headphones that I work out in. The audio quality is horrible. I'm driving unspiritually fast on I-81. And I call the guy who is too different than me for me to take seriously at the conference. And I call him up and he flips immediately to page 59 where the steps are. And I don't know why, for the first time in my life, it made sense. But he said, let's just do the steps right now. And I'm like, well, don't I have to meet with you? I'm driving to New York City. And he was like, no, you're going to die, man. And I said, okay. And when somebody tells you you're going to die, my ears perked up a little bit. And I said, what's step one? He said, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. And I didn't really understand powerlessness until that moment. I thought powerlessness meant in the same way I'm powerless right now to bench 300 pounds. Like I could maybe work really hard and bench 300 pounds one day. Like I'm powerless now, but I might not always be powerless. And he said, no, you're always going to be powerless over alcohol. You have a chronic progressive disease. It gets worse, never better. And for some reason in that moment, I listened. That's the only time I've listened in like my entire life, but I listened to that moment. And he said that our lives have become unmanageable. And I remembered the page 52 questions he asked me. And I'm in my car with all of my clothes in the dirty trunk, headed to my single mom friend's house in New York City, 6 hours away. And I'm like, fine, my life is unmanageable. You got me. Like, you're right. But then he says, great, we're on to step two. And I'm like, awesome, I'm making so much progress. My ego is being built up already. I'm in step one in my bottom and my ego is coming up already. Alcoholics are incredible people. And he said, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I said, hold on. I never really got the God stuff. And he's like, tell me why. And I'm like, well, I was an altar boy. And so here I am in the worst moment of my life. Everything that I had worked for is coming down around me. And I'm like, this one solution you're offering is not good enough for me. I actually might try something else. I was an altar boy when I was a kid. I believed for a long time that God was a very scary white man in the clouds who would like beam lightning down on me if I did something bad. I didn't want to believe that that type of God would save me. And I definitely thought that I had done too many things wrong up until that point for God to have any interest in solving my problems. And he said, well, let's take it easy. It says, if a man is willing to believe. And I said, where does it say that? And he says, in the big book. And he quoted the page number to me, and I won't do that to you right now, but he quoted the page number. And I'm like, fine, I'm willing to believe something. And he said, great, because you don't even have to believe in God. And I said, what? And he said, no, you already have a power greater than yourself, man. You have vodka. And I was like, well, fair enough. Vodka is kind of kicking my butt right now. So vodka is a power greater than myself. And he said, can you imagine that somewhere in the universe, think of the entire universe, think about every person in the world, think about the continents, this ocean, the land, the sea, volcanoes. Is there anything in the entire universe that's greater than a double shot of vodka right now? And I said, fine. I'm willing to believe that. And he said, great, we're on to step three. And that's how quick it can happen. See, one thing I don't mention at the beginning of a lot of my talks, and I've been giving a lot of talks lately, which is really cool and I really like it. My sobriety date is May 9th of last year. I have not been sober that long. But the point is that that's how fast this thing can work. We're on step two, and I'm 45 minutes into a drive on I-81. We go to step three, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And I'm like, again, I'm like, no, 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 I don't know. And he's like, what you're doing hasn't worked, man. What you're doing hasn't worked. And I had to cop to that because I had tried. I had been trying in my entire life when it talks about the actor trying to play the director, but he's only just the actor. I had tried to be the director of my life and I had failed. I had finally failed all the way. There was no way that I was going to try harder because I had tried every single different way. I had tried apps to control my drinking. I tried pure meditation. I tried paying therapists. I tried all the different ways of trying to control my drinking that never worked. I tried sobriety without a spiritual experience, and that didn't work. And I'm finally backed into a corner enough where my now sponsor said to me over the phone on I-81, I could remember exactly on Google Maps where it was. And he says, you're turning your will over to that thing that's greater than a double shot of vodka. That's it. And I said, fine, whatever that thing is, it can have it because I am dying and I don't know what to do. And he says, great. We just did step three. He said the prayer with me. We repeated after him. We did it in chunks. We weren't holding hands. I was driving 85 miles an hour. Like we didn't have to hold hands. We didn't have this white light spiritual experience. I try to give a deeper spiritual experience to my guys when I sponsor them now. But like the point is, when I was desperate and when I needed to hear it, God was there and God spoke through this man who I thought was so different than me that he couldn't offer me any advice. And God was speaking through this man and he said, is there a CVS in New York? And I said, there's a 24-hour CVS. And he said, here's how you do step four. Call me when you're done. And in 2 weeks, I was making amends. And a month later, I'm starting to sponsor people. And so I say these things not because I'm Mr. AA. I don't know anything about AA. I am the last person to ask any questions about AA too. But what I do know is that when you hit your bottom, these steps are the only way out. I've tried every other way out that there is, and I'm here to tell you that they don't work, but these steps do, and they work fast. One of the things I've really gotten into lately is the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And you read the early accounts, and Dr. Bob and Bill were literally dragging guys out of the house. They're doing steps one, two, and three in the living room. They do three up in the bedroom in front of a bunch of people, and guys are making amends in like a week. Like this program is meant to be worked as fast as we want it to work, as fast as it can with God as the center. And so I made my amends and I didn't do it perfectly. I'll say this only because I think sometimes it comes off like I did this whole 12-step thing perfectly on the first try. I very much did not. I made an amends to that ex who dumped me. And I made this really great amends. I talked to my sponsor about the first like 10 minutes of the amends, and it went really great. She didn't want to hear anything else from me. And I said the fateful words, I said, my sponsor is going to kill me, but. And I tried to get back together with her after making amends. Don't do that for what it's worth. If you ever end up moving to Rochester for a girl 9 months sober and you have to make amends to her, don't lead with trying to get back together with her. Just, I've done it for you. You don't have to do it. It does not work. So she leaves and it's okay. And I kind of massage the situation and it's like, I feel embarrassed and mostly I'm just annoyed that I don't get to go to our Europe trip that we had planned and she's going to go alone and see Taylor Swift in Edinburgh alone. And I'm like, this is really unfair. God must hate me. And so I keep going. I'm sponsoring guys. I'm actually involved in Alcoholics Anonymous. I start going to a book study. I'm learning. I'm making real friends. The fellowship I crave is coming about around me. But I still get a pit in my stomach whenever I see a black Subaru Impreza. And I say this because this is a step 10 and step 11 issue. Every single day, I text a guy in the program my step 11. And if you haven't done step 11, it's on 86 through 88. And it kind of just tells you exactly how to do a nightly inventory. It takes like 5 or 10 minutes. It's really helpful. But one of the questions in this nightly inventory that we are supposed to do every night, I'm not going to sit here and tell you I've done it every single night I've been sober, but it tells us to do it every night for a reason. And I believe one of the reasons is this. Every single day I was sober, even though things are getting better and I'm living in the sunlight of the spirit, finally, things are starting to go well for me, finally, I'm terrified of seeing her car. And in Rochester, New York, if you've ever been there, a lot of people drive four-wheel drive cars, a lot of people drive Subarus, and a lot of people drive black Subaru Imprezas. And so being afraid of a black Subaru Impreza on the road in Rochester, you are afraid all the time. And so I started being terrified of seeing this woman's car because I don't know. I start writing it in my 11 step inventory, and every single night it's coming up. What was I afraid of today? Seeing her car. What was I afraid of tomorrow? Seeing her car. What was I afraid of yesterday? Seeing her car. I finally go to my sponsor and I'm like, I'm losing my mind. Why am I so afraid of seeing her car? I thought the amends were supposed to lift this feeling. And he says, well, did you really make amends to her? And I said, yeah, but the famous sponsee love language. Yeah, but I tried to get back together with her too. And he's like, so you didn't really make amends to her. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was like, oh my God, I made a selfish amends. My very first amends as a newly recovered alcoholic, I made a selfish amends. I'm screwed. God hates me. I'm done. And I said, so what do I do? Like, I can't call her up and be like, can I make another amends to you? Like that seems worse. And he's like, the only thing there is to do right now is pray for the willingness to, if the situation ever arises where you are able to make an amends, a true amends without trying to get back together with her, then you pray for the willingness to have the strength to do it when it comes. And I said, fine, you're my sponsor. I guess I'll do that. I don't want to. That sounds stupid and it won't work. Because at this point, I realized that once again, God actually hates me. I prayed for 2 days. This woman who I haven't talked to in 6 months texts me out of the blue after I've been praying for the willingness to remake the amends, and she asks for a work favor that would have cost me hundreds of my own dollars to do, that I would have charged her company, which I know could afford it, hundreds of dollars to do this work favor. And I used to edit videos, so I was making an edit to an old video, and I had it on my computer and yada, yada, yada. Um, and she says, I don't have any money. Like, I don't want to ask you, but I'm asking you. And I sent a screenshot to my sponsor, and all he said was, what would God have you do? And in that moment, it was abundantly clear God was giving me a chance to make an amends. And I still had to stop myself from trying to be like, and also, how are you? And also, what's going on in your life? And also, do you want to get dinner later? But I didn't do any of that. I said, hey, here's the file you asked for. I spent my time working on it. It was an election season. I worked in politics. It was a very busy time for me, but I did it first priority because that was my amends. And that was my way of saying we can be right in God's universe and the spiritual economy together. And I say that because it involves a couple of steps. One, it involves an imperfect ninth step. So if you've made an imperfect ninth step, you're not screwed. God still has a plan for you. God's going to use it in some way. But it also involved, I had to do a 10th step on this woman with multiple people, and I couldn't unearth this resentment from me, even though I was doing multiple 10 steps. And then we had the last fallback, the 11th step nightly inventory. And my 11th step nightly inventory led me to this question that led me to a different prayer that led this situation to happen. So I have like a direct line from screwing up my 9 step amends to having a story that I can tell all my sponsees. And I was just working with a sponsee today, and I was able to be like, don't worry about it. I made the catastrophic error on my first 9 step amends. It's fine. So sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him. Like that used to read to me like a nothing sentence. It was like one of those sentences in the book that like sort of Bill was just kind of going off and writing, and he just kind of wrote that one off. But when I seek through prayer and meditation to improve my conscious contact with God, God showed up and God showed me how to make an amends that seemed unmakeable. And so now when I go into 12, having had a spiritual awakening, I can come to you and I can come to the Grace Group and I can come to meetings in Pittsburgh and I can say, I've had a genuine spiritual awakening, not because I'm smart, not because I'm Mr. AA, not because I've taken the biggest, flashiest service commitments, not because I've been sober for 50 years. I'm here because I've had a spiritual awakening as the result of the 12 steps, and only because of the results of the 12 steps. I have not had a spiritual awakening in therapy. I still go to therapy, no shade against therapy at all. I have not had a spiritual awakening from getting into a new relationship. I have not had a spiritual awakening from reading a bunch of books. I've had a spiritual awakening as a result of literally just doing the black parts of the page over and over and over and over again. And when it says to do something every night, I try to do it every night. When it says to do something in the morning, I try to do something every morning. When it says ask God, I use it as a prayer and I pray. And that's all that I've done. My sponsor used to say there's nobody who's too dumb for Alcoholics Anonymous, but there's a lot of people who are too smart for Alcoholics Anonymous. And I tried to make this program into John's program, John's way, for 2.5 years, and I ruined my life and I ruined the life of people around me. And now when I stop and I let God speak through other people, and I say, God, I'm stressed today. I don't know what to do. What always happens is I go to a meeting and I speak and I get a sponsee. And that person's problems are automatically bigger than my problems. And that person allows me to get outside of myself. And that 10-year-old boy and that 18-year-old kid that live inside me that needed a spiritual experience to overcome how bad they felt has been given a different spiritual experience at 36 that replaces and is even better and it can actually grow in Alcoholics Anonymous. And the spiritual experience that you get from alcohol is real. We all know it's real. That's why we're here. That's why we drank a lot of it. But the spiritual experience you get from alcohol has diminishing returns and it leads to a bottom. The spiritual experience you get from Alcoholics Anonymous is infinite and it grows and it grows and it grows and it grows. And if I could have predicted what would have happened to me as a result of working this program and only working this program, I would have sold myself way, way, way short. And I know I have a couple more minutes, but I'm a big fan of brevity. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for having me and for letting me share.